September 1st, 1939. War breaks out. Within days, the Bank of England makes a decision that will reshape Britain's financial system for the next 40 years. Exchange controls are introduced. For the first time in peacetime British history, the government seizes total control over foreign currency. British citizens cannot freely exchange pounds for dollars. Businesses cannot buy foreign goods without government permission. Every international transaction must be approved. The Bank of England, Britain's central bank, will now control every penny that flows across Britain's borders. This is the beginning of a secret financial war. While Churchill fights Hitler with tanks and planes, the Bank of England fights a different battle. A battle to keep the pound from collapsing. A battle to prevent runaway inflation. A battle to finance a war that costs more than Britain can afford. This battle is fought not with weapons, but with regulations, price controls, rationing, and financial manipulation. It's fought in underground vaults beneath the bank's headquarters on Threadneedle Street. And it's led by one of the most controversial figures in British financial history, Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England from 1920 to 1944, the man they called the currency dictator of Europe. This is the story of how the Bank of England financed World War II and kept Britain's economy from total collapse. Let's start with Montague Norman, because understanding him is critical to understanding what happened. Norman became governor of the Bank of England in 1920, right after World War I. He was 49 years old. Educated at Eton from a wealthy banking family. He looked like no other banker in history. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, a cape, and carried a walking stick. He had a goatee and spoke in cryptic riddles. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's greatest economist, said of him, "Always absolutely charming, always absolutely wrong." Norman was obsessed with gold. He believed paper money was dangerous. He believed the gold standard, where every pound was backed by a fixed amount of gold, was the only honest form of money. In 1925, Norman convinced Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, to return Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war parity of $4.86 per pound. This decision was a disaster. It overvalued the pound by 10%. British exports became too expensive. Unemployment exploded. The coal industry collapsed. The 1926 general strike followed. Britain's economy suffered through the late 1920s. In 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard in humiliation. Norman's reputation was damaged, but he remained governor. When World War II started in 1939, Norman was still running the Bank of England. He'd been governor for 19 years. And now he faced a crisis bigger than anything he'd dealt with before. Britain needed to finance a war. That meant massive government spending. More spending than tax revenue could cover. The government would have to borrow enormous amounts. And borrowing creates money. More money chasing fewer goods means inflation. Norman had to prevent inflation from destroying the pound's value. He also had to prevent Britain from running out of foreign currency, especially dollars. Without dollars, Britain couldn't buy American weapons and supplies. Norman's job was to keep the pound stable, control inflation, manage war finance, and prevent a currency collapse. All at the same time. All while fighting Hitler. The first move came on September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after Germany invaded Poland and 1 day after Britain declared war. The government introduced the Defense Finance Regulations Act. This gave the Treasury and the Bank of England sweeping emergency powers. Exchange controls were imposed immediately. What did exchange controls mean? It meant the government controlled all foreign currency transactions. If a British business wanted to buy goods from America, it had to apply to the Bank of England for permission to exchange pounds for dollars. These controls were administered by the Bank of England's Exchange Control Department. Before the war, this department barely existed. Now it became one of the largest operations in the bank. Hundreds of clerks processed applications. Every transaction was scrutinized. The goal was simple: conserve dollars. Britain didn't have enough dollars to buy everything it needed. America demanded cash payment for weapons and supplies. The Neutrality Acts, American laws passed in the 1930s, required Britain to pay in gold or dollars and transport goods on British ships. No credit, cash only. So every dollar mattered. Exchange controls ensured that dollars were used only for essential wartime needs. Not for luxuries, not for investment, not for tourism, for war. But exchange controls alone weren't enough. The Bank of England created something even more important: the sterling area. This was a currency bloc that included Britain and most of the British Empire. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Egypt, and dozens of colonies joined. These countries agreed to 3 things. First, they would peg their currencies to the pound at fixed exchange rates. Second, they would hold their foreign currency reserves in London in pounds. Third, they would impose exchange controls together with Britain. Inside the sterling area, currency could move freely. An Australian could convert Australian pounds to British pounds easily. A South African could buy goods from India using pounds. No restrictions within the bloc. But transactions with countries outside the sterling area, especially America, were tightly controlled. All dollars earned by sterling area countries had to be pooled in London. The Bank of England managed this dollar pool and rationed dollars to the entire bloc. Why did this matter? Because it multiplied Britain's buying power. When Australia exported wool to America and earned dollars, those dollars went to London. When South Africa sold gold and earned dollars, those dollars went to London. When India exported tea and earned dollars, those dollars went to London. The Bank of England collected all these dollars and used them to buy American weapons and supplies for the entire empire's war effort. The sterling area turned the British Empire into a single economic unit. It protected the pound by creating a closed trading bloc, and it gave Britain access to the dollar earnings of the entire empire. Without the sterling area, Britain would have run out of dollars much faster. Now let's talk about inflation. This was Norman's obsession. During World War I, Britain had experienced serious inflation. Prices roughly doubled between 1914 and 1918. After the war, prices fell sharply, causing deflation and unemployment. Norman was determined not to repeat this. Inflation during World War II had to be controlled. But how do you control inflation during a war? Wars are inflationary by nature. The government borrows massive amounts. Banks create new money to buy government bonds. The money supply explodes. At the same time, consumer goods become scarce because factories are making tanks instead of toasters. More money chasing fewer goods equals inflation. It's mathematical. To prevent this, the Bank of England and the government used three main strategies: price controls, rationing, and subsidies. Price controls were introduced immediately. The prices of goods. Act 1939 gave the government power to fix maximum prices for essential goods. The goal was to prevent profiteering and keep prices stable. Food prices were controlled by the Ministry of Food. They set maximum prices for meat, dairy, bread, vegetables, everything. Retailers couldn't charge more than the official price. If they did, they faced fines or imprisonment. The Board of Trade controlled prices for clothing, furniture, and household goods. The Ministry of Supply controlled prices for industrial materials like steel, coal, and oil. Prices were based on pre-war costs, plus allowances for increases in import costs, or justified increases in production costs. Any price increases beyond that were considered profiteering and were illegal. But price controls alone create shortages. If you freeze the price of meat at 1939 levels, but demand exceeds supply, shelves go empty. People with money can't buy what they want because there isn't enough. The solution was rationing. Food rationing began in January 1940. Bacon, butter, and sugar were rationed first. By August 1942, almost all foods except vegetables and bread were rationed. Every person received a ration book with coupons. To buy rationed goods, you had to register at specific shops and present coupons. The coupons limited how much you could buy. For example, the weekly ration per adult in 1942 was 4 ounces of bacon or ham, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of cheese, 8 ounces of sugar, and 2 ounces of tea. Meat was rationed by price, not weight. You got about 1 shilling's worth per week. That's enough for about 1 pound of cheap meat or half a pound of better quality. Rationing was egalitarian. Rich and poor received the same rations. A millionaire got the same 4 ounces of bacon as a factory worker. This prevented hoarding and ensured everyone had access to basic foods. The poor were actually better fed during the war than before it. In the 1930s, many working-class families couldn't afford adequate nutrition. During the war, rationing guaranteed everyone got enough calories, protein, and vitamins. Children received free milk and orange juice. Pregnant women got extra rations. The wartime diet was boring, mostly bread, potatoes, and vegetables. But it was adequate. Malnutrition declined, public health improved. Rationing extended beyond food. Clothing was rationed from June 1941. Each person received 66 coupons per year. A man's suit required 26 coupons. A woman's dress required 11 coupons. Shoes required 5 coupons. The coupons had to last the entire year. People mended old clothes instead of buying new ones. The government promoted the slogan, "Make do and mend." Petrol was rationed from the start of the war. Private motoring was essentially banned by 1942. Only essential workers got petrol rations. Coal for home heating was rationed. Soap was rationed. Even furniture was controlled under the utility scheme, which limited what manufacturers could produce. The third strategy was subsidies. The government subsidized basic foods to keep prices down. In 1942 to 1943, $145 million was spent on food subsidies. That's equivalent to over $8 billion today, about $10.5 billion. $35 million went to bread, flour, and oatmeal. $23 million went to meat. $23 million went to potatoes. $11 million went to milk. $13 million went to eggs. These subsidies meant that even though the government was spending massively on the war and the money supply was expanding, the official cost of living stayed relatively stable. Subsidies absorbed some of the inflationary pressure. Workers didn't demand huge wage increases because their food costs stayed manageable. So did it work? Did the Bank of England and the government successfully control inflation? Yes. Surprisingly, yes. During World War II, from 1939 to 1945, British inflation was remarkably contained. Wholesale prices rose about 50% during the war. Retail prices rose even less, roughly 31% from 1939 to 1945. Compare this to World War I, when prices roughly doubled in 4 years. The inflation rate during World War II averaged about 5% per year. That's high by peacetime standards, but incredibly low for total war. For comparison, after World War II ended and controls were removed, inflation jumped to over 20% in 1947. This proves the controls had been working. They'd been suppressing inflation artificially. Once removed, the pent-up pressure exploded, but during the war itself, inflation was contained. How was this achieved? 3 things. Price controls and rationing prevented prices from rising, even though demand exceeded supply. Subsidies kept the official cost of living down, and most importantly, people saved. During the war, there wasn't much to buy. Consumer goods were scarce, luxuries disappeared, factories made weapons, not radios. So people saved their money. Personal savings rates soared. In 1938, British households saved about 4% of disposable income. By 1943, the savings rate had jumped to 20%. People had income, but nothing to spend it on. The money sat in bank accounts. This reduced the velocity of money. Money wasn't chasing goods because there were no goods to chase. This dampened inflation. The Bank of England also financed the war through borrowing, not just money printing. The government sold war bonds to British citizens. These were marketed with massive propaganda campaigns, posters everywhere. National Savings Week, Tank Week, Warship Week. The campaigns worked. Millions of people bought war bonds. The bonds paid 3% interest, which was low, but people bought them out of patriotism and because there was nothing else to spend money on. War bond sales raised significant sums. However, they didn't cover the full cost of the war. Most war finance came from borrowing from banks, especially from the Bank of England itself. The bank created money and lent it to the government. This is called monetary financing. It expands the money supply. Normally this causes inflation. But because of price controls, rationing, and high savings rates, inflation was suppressed. Now, let's talk about the Bank of England's operations during the war. The war changed everything about how the bank functioned. When war broke out, the bank prepared for German bombing. Much of the bank's operations were evacuated from London. The printing works moved to Overton in Hampshire. The accountants department moved to Hurstbourne Park. The gold reserves were secretly moved to secure locations outside London, some of it sent to Canada for safekeeping. The senior staff who remained at Threadneedle Street moved into underground vaults beneath the building. Directors lived and worked underground. They slept on cots. They ate in makeshift canteens. The bank's headquarters became a fortress. Windows were sandbagged. Fire watchers patrolled the roof during air raids. During the Blitz in 1940 and 1941, bombs fell near the bank, but it was never hit directly. The bank's day-to-day work intensified dramatically. Now, we need to talk about Montague Norman's most controversial action during the war. In March 1939, months before the war started, Czechoslovakia was invaded by Nazi Germany. The Czech Central Bank held gold reserves in London for safekeeping. This was common. Many countries held gold in London because the Bank of England was trusted. The Czech gold was worth about $5.6 million, roughly $28 million. After Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, the Nazi Reichsbank demanded this gold be transferred to German accounts. The request went through the Bank for International Settlements, a Swiss-based institution where central banks coordinated. Montague Norman was a director of the BIS. He approved the transfer. $5.6 million in Czech gold was moved from Czech accounts to German accounts, all without the gold physically leaving London. It was a bookkeeping entry. But it meant Germany now owned Czech gold. The British government didn't know about this until later. When they found out, there was outrage. Members of Parliament demanded explanations. How could Norman transfer Czech gold to Nazi Germany? In May 1939, Chancellor of the Exchequer John Simon wrote to Norman, asking whether the bank was still holding Czech gold. Norman replied evasively. He said the bank held gold from time to time for the BIS and had no knowledge of whether it was the BIS's own property or their customers' property. This was technically true, but deeply misleading. Norman knew the gold belonged to Czechoslovakia. He knew it was being taken by Germany, but he claimed the Bank of England couldn't refuse to follow an order from a customer, the BIS, to transfer gold between accounts. In autumn 1939, 2 months after war broke out, Norman tried to support another transfer of Czech gold to Germany. This time, the British government intervened and blocked it. Parliament was furious. A bill was introduced to force the Bank of England to consult with the government before making any financial decisions where national interests were involved. Norman's actions damaged his reputation permanently. Some historians argue he was simply following technical banking procedures. Others argue he was sympathetic to Germany, or at least unwilling to politicize central banking. Still others argue he was incompetent and failed to grasp the moral implications. Whatever the reason, the Czech gold scandal tarnished Norman's legacy. Despite this, Norman remained governor throughout most of the war. He finally retired in 1944 at age 73 after a fall and declining health. He'd been governor for 24 years, the longest tenure in Bank of England history. After retirement, he was raised to the peerage as Baron Norman. He died in 1950. His governorship was marked by brilliance and catastrophic errors. He modernized the Bank of England, transforming it from a private bank into a true central bank. He established the Exchange Equalization Account in 1932, which managed the pound's value after leaving gold. He played a critical role in financing both world wars, but he also pushed Britain back onto the gold standard in 1925, causing years of unemployment, and he transferred Czech gold to Nazi Germany in 1939. Keynes's verdict remains true: always absolutely charming, always absolutely wrong. Norman's successor as governor was Lord Cato, who served from 1944 to 1949. But by then, the war was nearly over, and the bank's wartime strategies were set. In 1946, the Labour government nationalized the Bank of England. From 1694 until 1946, the bank had been privately owned by stockholders. After nationalization, it became a public institution owned by the government. This reflected the reality that the bank had functioned as an arm of government throughout the war. Formal independence no longer made sense. The bank remained nationalized until 1998, when it gained operational independence for monetary policy while staying publicly owned. Let's assess the bank's wartime performance. On inflation control, the bank succeeded beyond expectations. Wartime inflation averaged 5% annually, far below World War I levels. This was achieved through price controls, rationing, subsidies, and high savings rates. The cost of living rose only 31% during 6 years of total war. This kept worker morale high and prevented the wage price spiral that had devastated economies during World War I. On war finance, the bank successfully managed the massive borrowing required. National debt rose from 135% of GDP in 1939 to 249% in 1945. This was sustainable because inflation was controlled and economic output was mobilized for war. The bank issued war bonds, coordinated with the Treasury, and managed the government's accounts smoothly throughout the war. Britain never defaulted. The pound never collapsed during wartime. On exchange controls in the sterling area, the bank created an effective system to conserve dollars and manage foreign currency. Without this system, Britain would have run out of dollars by 1941 and been unable to buy American supplies. Exchange controls in the sterling area pooled the empire's dollar earnings and rationed them efficiently. This kept Britain fighting until Lend-Lease started in 1941. Even after Lend-Lease, exchange controls prevented capital flight and protected the pound's external value. The system worked. It was bureaucratic, restrictive, and anti-free market. But it worked. The costs were real, though. Exchange controls remained in place until 1979, 40 years after they were introduced. Rationing lasted until 1954. Price controls distorted markets. Black markets flourished. People circumvented regulations when they could. Farmers held back food from official channels. Consumers traded under the counter when possible. The black market undermined the egalitarian purpose of rationing, but it didn't destroy the system. Most people followed the rules most of the time. And the fact that rationing and controls stayed in place so long after the war suggests they had created vested interests and habits that were hard to break. The sterling area also had long-term costs. It tied former colonies to Britain economically long after they gained political independence. Sterling balances, the pounds held by India, Egypt, and other countries, became a burden. These countries wanted to exchange their pounds for dollars to buy American goods. But Britain couldn't afford massive conversions, so Britain restricted when and how sterling balances could be used. This created tension. In 1947, when Britain tried to make the pound convertible, as required by the American Loan Agreement, sterling holders rushed to exchange pounds for dollars. Britain lost nearly $1 billion in 5 weeks. Convertibility was suspended. The sterling area limped on until 1972 when it finally ended. In many ways, the wartime exchange controls in sterling area outlived their usefulness, but couldn't be dismantled because too many interests depended on them. Here's the final assessment. The Bank of England's secret war was a success during wartime, but created problems afterward. Montagu Norman and his successors kept inflation contained, financed the war without currency collapse, and managed exchange controls effectively. Britain's wartime financial system was more successful than in World War I. Prices stayed more stable. The pound maintained external value better. The black market was smaller, but the costs included 40 years of financial repression. Exchange controls strangled free capital movement until 1979. Rationing bred a culture of government control and bureaucracy. The sterling area became a trap that delayed Britain's adjustment to a post-imperial world, and Montagu Norman's reputation was permanently damaged by the Czech gold scandal. The lesson is that wartime finance requires wartime measures. Price controls, rationing, exchange controls, these worked during the emergency. They prevented inflation from destroying the pound. They conserved scarce dollars. They kept Britain fighting. But emergency measures should end when the emergency ends. Britain's mistake was keeping wartime controls long after the war. By 1950, the emergency was over, but the controls remained. They distorted the economy for decades. They delayed Britain's recovery, and they contributed to Britain's relative economic decline compared to less regulated economies like Germany's. The Bank of England won the wartime financial battle, but the victory came at a cost that Britain paid for 2 generations.